Welcome to the Journal. There was good news and bad news about Afghanistan this week, and it was the same news. That's right. The Senate held confirmation hearings for Lieutenant General Stanley McChrystal, slated to be the next commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Here's how two different news organizations reported his testimony. The Associated Press headline read, "War in Afghanistan is winnable." But the Washington Independent reported that the general had, quote, painted a bleak picture of the Afghanistan war and that the United States needed to show significant progress within 18 to 24 months or risk the war spiraling out of control. What we know for sure is that the fighting in Afghanistan is escalating. At least 21,000 more American troops are going in, and the number of private security contractors working for the military there jumped 29% in the last 3 months alone. Get this, there are now more private contractors in Afghanistan than there are U.S. soldiers. And as of next year, according to new Pentagon documents, the war in Afghanistan will be costing more than the war in Iraq. It's the job of experienced, knowledgeable investigative reporters to throw a monkey wrench into the spin machine and try to make some sense of all this. They're an endangered species, but one of the best in the business is Jeremy Scahill, who's been digging into Pentagon documents and thick congressional hearings for several years now. He's twice winner of the George Polk Award for Special Achievement in Journalism and author of this best-selling book, Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. Jeremy now runs the new website, Rebel Reports. Jeremy Scahill, welcome back to the Journal.
It's great to be with you, Bill.
How do you explain this spike in private contractors in both Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, I think what we're seeing under President Barack Obama is sort of old wine in a new bottle. Obama is sending one message to the world, but the reality on the ground, particularly when it comes to private military contractors, is that the status quo remains from the Bush era. Right now, there are 250,000 contractors fighting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's about 50% of the total U.S. fighting force, which is very similar to what it was under Bush. In Iraq, President Obama has 130,000 contractors, and we just saw a 23% increase in the number of armed contractors in Iraq. In Afghanistan, there's been a 29% increase in armed contractors. So the radical privatization of war continues unabated under Barack Obama. Having said that, when Barack Obama was in the Senate, he was one of the only people that was willing to take up this issue. And he put forward what became the leading legislation on the part of the Democrats to reform the contracting industry. And I give him credit for doing that because he saw this as an important issue before a lot of other political figures and spoke up at a time when a lot of people were deafeningly silent on this issue. And President Obama has carried on a policy where he has tried to implement greater accountability structures. We now know in a much clearer way than we did under Bush how many contractors we have on the battlefield. He's attempted to implement some form of rules governing contractors and has suggested that there should be greater accountability when they do commit crimes. All of these things are a step in the right direction. But ultimately, I think that we have to look to what Jan Schakowsky, the congresswoman from Illinois, says. We can no longer allow these individuals to perform what are inherently governmental functions, and that includes carrying a weapon on U.S. battlefields, and that's certainly not where President Obama is right now.
But many people will say, of course, the truth, which is he inherited a quagmire from the Bush administration. What's he to do? Well,
there's no question that Obama inherited an absolute mess from President Bush, but the reality is that Obama is escalating the war in Afghanistan right now and is maintaining the occupation of Iraq. If Obama was serious about fully ending the occupation of Iraq, he wouldn't allow the U.S. to have a colonial fortress that they're passing off as an embassy in Baghdad. Bill, this place is the size of 80 football fields. Who do you think is going to run the security operation for this 80 football field size embassy? Well, it's mercenary contractors.
So we're supposed to be withdrawing from Iraq, but you're suggesting in all that you've written that I've read lately that we will be leaving a large mercenary force there.
Absolutely. In fact, you're going to have a sizable presence, not only of U.S. forces, certainly in the region, but also in Iraq, these residual forces. I mean, Bill, you remember during Vietnam, the people who were classified as military advisors or analysts, and in reality, the U.S. was fighting an undeclared war. So in Iraq, I think that we've seen reports from Jim Miklaszewski, NBC News' Pentagon correspondent. He's quoting military sources saying that they expect to be in Iraq 15 to 20 years in sizable numbers. Afghanistan, though, really is going to become Obama's war, and unfortunately many Democrats are portraying it as the good war.
Let me show you a snippet of what he said in Cairo on Thursday. Take a look.
Now, make no mistake, we do not want to keep our troops in Afghanistan. We seek no military bases there. It is agonizing for America to lose our young men and women. It is costly and politically difficult to continue this conflict. We would gladly bring every single one of our troops home if we could be confident that there were not violent extremists in Afghanistan and now Pakistan determined to kill as many Americans as they possibly can. But that is not yet the case.
Well, I mean, we have two parallel realities here. We have the speeches of President Obama. I'm not questioning his sincerity. And then you have the sort of official punditry that's allowed access to the corporate media. And they have one debate. On the ground, though, in Afghanistan and Pakistan, you hear the stories of the people that are forced to live on the other side of the barrel of the gun that is U.S. foreign policy, and you get a very different sense. If the United States, as President Obama says, doesn't want a permanent presence in Afghanistan, why allocate $1 billion to build this fortress-like embassy, similar to the one in Baghdad, in Islamabad, Pakistan, another one in Peshawar, having an increase in mercenary forces, expanding the U.S. military presence there?
Walter Pincus is an old friend of mine, an investigative reporter at the Washington Post for, 30 or more years now, a very respected man. He reported in the Washington Post last fall that these contracts indicate how long the United States intends to remain in Afghanistan. And he pointed, for example, to a contract given by the Corps of Engineers to a firm in Dubai to expand the prison, the U.S. prison at Bagram in Afghanistan. What does that say to you?
Look, we have President Obama making it a point regularly to say we're going to have Guantanamo closed by early next year. The fact is that at Bagram, we see an expansion. They're spending $60 million to expand that prison. You have hundreds of people held without charges. You have people that are being denied access to the Red Cross in violation of international law. And you have an ongoing position by the Obama administration, formed under Bush, that these prisoners don't have right to habeas corpus. There are very disturbing signals being sent with Afghanistan as a microcosm, not to mention these regular attacks that we're seeing inside of Pakistan that have killed upwards of 700 civilians using these robotic drones since 2006, including 100 since Obama took power.
Some people have suggested that the increasing reliance on military contractors in Afghanistan underscores the fact that the military is actually stretched very thin. General McChrystal said this week, he admitted that he doesn't even know if we have enough troops there to deal with the situation as it is now. Does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't surprise me because this is increasingly turning into a war of occupation. That's why General McChrystal is making that statement. If this was about fighting terrorism, it would be viewed as a law enforcement operation where you're going to hunt down criminals responsible for these actions and bring them in front of a court of law. This is turning into a war of occupation. And if I might add about General McChrystal, what message does it send to the Afghan people when President Obama chooses a man who is alleged to have been one of the key figures running secret detention facilities in Iraq and working on these extrajudicial killing squads, hunting down quote-unquote insurgents and killing them on behalf of the U.S. military? This is a man who's also alleged to have been at the center of the cover-up of Pat Tillman's death, who was killed by U.S. Army Rangers.
He apologized for that this week, by the way, before Congress.
Well, it's easy to apologize when your new job is on the line. It's a different thing to take responsibility for it when you realize that the mistake was made or that you were involved with what the family of Pat Tillman says was a cover-up.
You talk about military contractors. Do you think the American people have any idea how their tax dollars are being used in Afghanistan?
Right. Absolutely no idea whatsoever. We've spent $190 billion on the war in Afghanistan, and some estimates say that within a few short years it could end up at $500 billion. The fact is that I think most Americans are not aware that their dollars being spent on Afghanistan are in fact going to for-profit corporations in both Iraq and Afghanistan. These are companies that are simultaneously working for profit and for the U.S. government. That is the intricate linking of corporate profits to an escalation of war that President Eisenhower warned against in his farewell address. We live amidst the most radical privatization agenda in the history of our country, and it cuts across every aspect of our society.
You recently wrote about how the Department of Defense paid the former Halliburton subsidiary KBR more than $80 million in bonuses for contracts to install what proved to be very defective electrical wiring in Iraq. Senator Byron Dorgan himself called that wiring in hearings shoddy and unprofessional. So my question is, why did the Pentagon pay for it when it was so inferior?